Welcome everyone here in this room and our for the attendees online. It's great to see you all here, and thank you for joining us in this exciting workshop. I'm Anna Trianda-Pulido, and I hold the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I would like to start our meeting today with a land acknowledgement. We're privileged to meet today in Toronto, that is the Dish with One Spoon territory, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga tribes. And the Dish with One Spoon is a really beautiful message which says that our natural resources are a dish and we all share with them in one spoon, which means we're invited in friendship and in peace to share these resources, and we have a responsibility, I feel, both to the generations that were before us and to the generations to come. And I think at the time of climate change and, acute actually weather, phenomena happening around the world, this is really a very pertinent message. I also want to add that we feel at TMU, we're putting our very little tiny stone in the work of truth and reconciliation by at least changing our name from Ryerson University to Toronto Metropolitan. And also, I have to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest to this land. I came to Canada 4 years ago, and I'm still really working on my responsibility towards truth and reconciliation. That is truly, even as a migration scholar, it's almost still in contradiction, but still that I'm in a contradiction to truth and reconciliation, because, migration is probably part of settler colonialism. So without further ado, again, I would like to welcome you all to this workshop that we have called The Future of Human Mobility, a bit of a bold title, but we hope that the discussions today, which are kind of this blue sky thinking or open-ended, really interdisciplinary discussions, will be fruitful. I want to first start by acknowledging that the thinking about this started with the gentleman over there, Robert McLehman, and a group of other people, including Brenda, Ibrahim, Igor there, in our idea to start a network and do some such events where we would bring our very different disciplinary perspectives, not just sociology, geography, and political science, but also, for instance, psychology, computer science, to think about how human mobility is changing, because oftentimes we find, I do all these statements all the time, international migration is increasing, there's more and more people leaving, or asylum seeking and refugees are increasing, all the world is changing, but then there are other things that are happening, I think, in the broader realm of socioeconomic, political, but also technological transformation that are changing the whole context, and within that, they're changing human mobility. And just to name a few, of this phenomena, like the pandemic, I think was one, and actually our conversations were happening during the pandemic. For instance, Robert and I had the opportunity to meet once in person, like the day before Canadian universities closed. And then the conversation had to continue online for more than 2 years. But it was, for instance, that like a complete breakdown of physical mobility and a completely new dimension of transnational connectivity, where only the time zone was the only limit to that. And I remember meeting with Brenda, where for Brenda it was midnight, and for us it was early morning. So that is one thing. The other thing is really. It's more than a year ago, about 2 years ago, that the metaverse became very popular. Actually, I think kind of calmed down in the last years, but there was this big hype, and we were discussing even with Ibrahim and others, like, what does this mean? Will we live and invest and work in some virtual world? But then where will we be physically present? Because we were having this interesting conversation. It's like, okay, you'll be able to work and invest in the metaverse. Okay, I can perceive that. But then I was saying, but I'll still be in Toronto. I'll be hungry in Toronto. So how will I? And we were having this interesting conversations, and even also the whole question of environment and the change of environmental conditions and environmental degradation, or if you want improvement. Canada is on Except for extreme weather events, we are to gain if the planet is warming. We may have, longer summers and shorter winters. So the idea was to then pin down some topics like we did for this workshop and really try to engage and think of new questions rather than of new answers. And I think for me, success for this workshop after this 1.5 day of discussions will be to have a set of new questions or new topics that we want to explore. So this is where this all comes from. I want to say that it is an experiment for us too, to have it really complete dialogical. I believe all registered attendees, both in person and online, received the papers. They are very short papers, as you can see, so because kind of just framing the discussion. And the idea is that our chairpersons, Audrey, has had the kindness to accept to be the first chair for this morning. We'll do the regular chair job, so together with the co-chairs. But the idea is that each one of us will take 5 or 7 minutes to present their paper, and there's some designated discussants that will take another 5 to 7 minutes to raise some issues. And then it will be completely open to all of us for conversation. So we really value your contributions. And without further ado, I'll give the baton to Audrey.
I'll happily take it. Welcome, everybody, and thank you. It's an honor to chair this first panel. And I thought I would just remind you of what the theme is, and then we'll launch in. The questions that are posed in the program are this. Can we come up with an analytical framework that brings together both voluntary and forced migration and mobility, as well as community displacement? Do we need new concepts to discuss physical and virtual mobility and presence? The position papers will be delivered by Anna Triandafiloglu, who, as you know, he's just heard from, and everybody knows here is the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration here at TNU. And the other by Brenda Yo, who's Raffles Professor of Social Sciences at National University of Singapore. And then our discussants will be Professor Ibrahim Bagheri of TNU, Jaconda Herrera of Flaxo in Ecuador, and finally Christy Eddy of University of Washington. Forgive me for stumbling. I'm going to turn it over first to Anna to begin, and I'll be beginning as a ruthless timekeeper.
Oh my God, that's
so you're marking that.
Yeah. Yeah, and for our online attendees, actually, our colleague Shiva Mohan is the co-chair. So, in terms of housekeeping, Audrey will take questions first from the floor, and then Shiva will. For the online attendees, we don't give the possibility of asking your question with the mic, but you should write it in the chat, and Shiva will be following the chat and grouping in the question. So anyhow, so I come back to introducing my position paper, and actually Brenda, I read yours, and I think we're, without having it planned, very close. We're nicely complementary. So my position paper that I hope most of you have read was reflecting on what I just said generally about how mobility is changing, and not just the distinction between voluntary and forced mobility has been something that we've been debated in migration studies for quite some time, saying it's a continuum, not an on and off, because no one is totally free to, take a decision to move. But even those who flee war or persecution have some degree of agency in deciding where they're going. So this is certainly one aspect that we should keep in mind. Of course, the other idea that I'm presenting in the paper is that we need to consider the temporal nature of mobility. Again, in migration studies, we often speak about kind of settlement, long-term migration. And we've seen this, of course, historically evolving as transportation and communication has evolved. But we also speak of temporary or seasonal migration that is supposed to be tightly regulated for a short period of time. The person is expected to return to their country of origin, but we also know that this often is not the case and that the realities on the ground are much more complex than this, and particularly today, also thanks to changes in technology in terms, again, of communication and transportation, we see people doing much more complicated trajectories where it's not between A and B, but rather from A, you go to B, you go to C, maybe back to A, maybe to D, etc. However, going to the spatial aspect of mobility, that's where we see something new, happening, which is the interconnection between the actual physical mobility and the digital or virtual mobility. And as I said before, we all realize not just, how scientific cooperation could happen through, these digital connections, but even connecting with family and friends, events happening fully online. And also the way in which information has been, how can I say, traveling so quickly. And I remember, I should say, this is not such a new phenomenon of the pandemic. I think there was a breakthrough in 2011 when the Arab Spring happened, and it's the first time we see what was called citizen journalism. So people being in Tahrir Square in Cairo reporting with their smartphones. That was actually the first. I mean, I'm not sure when the smartphones came to our lives, but that was one moment where they were common enough for people to film the protests or film, the violence in Tahrir Square and send it to the world in real time, which then we see also changes even the way the media work, because the media didn't need to send their journalists in place, their correspondents. They could take these films or these reportings that were already at the time going to Facebook. So we're there for everyone to see. And that shows us how this, the whole temporal and spatial dimension is changing, and the relation between those. An element that I think I'm trying to bring into this analytical framework that is relatively new, at least from a migration studies perspective, is to put the individual and the collective aspect together. Generally, when we think of migration and asylum, we tend to think about one person or their household that is the migrant or is the person seeking protection. But when we speak, for instance, about community displacement, we generally take it as, to be honest, like myself as a migration scholar, I've never worked on community displacement. Some scholars, and I have in mind, for instance, Saskia Sassen, have talked about, dispossession and how whole communities, lose their land and their means of subsistence. But this has not been really very much connected to the general migration studies. So I am proposing that we should also use this dimension of collective versus individual. And the other element is more a question mark for me. I'm proposing it, but it is up for discussion. Yeah, whether we should include in this thinking the kind of leisure mobility or business mobility, and I'm always inspired by the work of Zygmunt Bauman when he was talking about the vagabonds and the tourists or the cosmopolitans. So the cosmopolitans, should I say, are people like us, or those who travel for business or for leisure and have strong passports. And the vagabonds are those who have no capacity to travel because they have no documents that allow them to cross borders seamlessly, but are actually moving because they have very strong reasons to move. And so the question is, should we include those cosmopolitans or those travelers into an analytical framework, or this is completely detached from what we're talking about and should be left out? Then another element in this analytical framework is, what do we do with involuntary immobility? So what has been called in migration studies, the people who wish to move but cannot, either because they don't have the material resources or because they don't have, the right documents, be they passports and visas, and, are tightly regulated by migration policies. So concluding, and I think I'll conclude before 5 minutes. So I'm proposing 4 types of mobility for us to consider. So one is this individual mobility of long distance tourism and business travel. And, there are some colleagues in the broader geography and migration studies that even try to calculate number of trips And I had this, this number of, what I can't remember how many billion or trillion trips that are happening worldwide, 4.7 trillion trips in a year globally prior to the COVID pandemic, so in 2019. And one wonders, what do I make of this number? And whether actually after the pandemic, I mean, during the pandemic, and I want to emphasize our thinking started during the pandemic. We were thinking, oh, this is going to change because we're not going to travel very much anymore. We're going to be much more selective. And I think what we saw now is no, we went back. Both the classical migration has gone back to normal, and also, traveling generally. I mean, we saw this again this last year. The tourism traveling kind of completely boomed as it was before. The second type of mobility I'm considering is in more classical epistemic terms we call migration, which is a movement that can be individual, but also could be in some ways considered as collective if there is, a very sustained movement. For instance, I'm thinking, say, Nepalese workers going to the Gulf, or also, I don't know, Indian workers going to the Gulf, to the extent that we could consider this a collective movement. But then migration is about kind of economically motivated mobility, and there I think it can encompass all sorts of such mobility, which could be temporary or long-term, repeated, circular, and it could be, fully in line with policies or at the fringe of policies or totally undocumented. Then the third type of mobility I'm considering is asylum seeking and refugees. So people moving predominantly for reasons of seeking protection. But again, the problem for me is that the distinction between the economic and the humanitarian reasons can be really a very kind of a continuum where people usually have mixed motivations, and they can be obviously predominantly seeking protection or predominantly economic. And I think in that sense, the term forced migration is probably a better term because it shows us different levels of coercion and constraints that you may have when you decide to move. And a fourth type of mobility I'm considering is involuntary displacement, and I'm considering that mostly at the collective and the community level. And I have in mind people who are being displaced because, for instance, of environmental degradation and health and climate conditions, which can relate to to all the lower lying places in the earth these days. But it can also refer to communities that have lost their traditional habitat. And again, the obvious example could be, communities in the Amazon forests having to move because, yes, they can no longer live. But a related type of mobility could be people moving within a city. For instance, we know that in Beijing during the Olympics, like before the Olympics, entire neighborhoods were moved so to be gentrified so that it would look good when people would visit the city. But this also has happened in places like Barcelona and elsewhere for similar reasons. So I would like to leave it at that, and I hope we can have a discussion about these four types of mobility and whether they offer a good analytical framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Meta. I'm going to turn it over now to Brenda.
All right, I tried to write it out so that it's timed. So the future of mobility, I think, from what we hear from Anna, is definitely going to be highly diverse in terms of both the spatial and temporal patterns, but also in terms of volume and velocity, sequence and directionality, and across the choice constraint continuum. So to try to grapple with such kaleidoscopic variety, I thought we needed to start with some conceptual tools at a level which will help us make sense of the diversity that we see in empirical reality. So digging around the migration literature, I thought of three sets of ideas. The first is the notion of mobility regime. And this mobility regime approach highlights border control regulations and governance of the entry, settlement, and the place of migrants in both receiving and sending societies. So, and it draws attention to, I think, what Anna has already mentioned, the mobility disparities between the highly mobile elite and the immobilized, marginalized populations. Because the concept does call to attention the role of a wide range of actors, from individual states, but also intermediaries, humanitarian organizations to international regulatory systems. And it foregrounds for me the role of norms and discourses in the regulation of migration and mobilities, but as well as the regulatory practices and the power relations and the relations of inequality. So this idea of looking at norms, discourses, and practices, I think, is part of regime theory. So my own work has focused on temporary migration regime that has, as already said, expanded very rapidly in place of pathways to permanency and citizenship. So in recent decades, the temporary migration regime has expanded, and that's bolstered by discourse about triple win, migration and development, border securitization, me-first nationalism, and the protection of citizenship rights. So whilst permanent migration, these pathways usually entail the accumulation of entitlements associated with citizenship, temporary labor migration is dependent on a very different set of practices based on a social contract that is rooted in enforced transience and compounding precaritization. So that's the first idea that I thought could be interesting to look at. The second sort of concept is mobility infrastructure. The infrastructural turn in migration studies, I think, highlights that migration is a heavily mediated process and draws attention to the diverse set of actors that occupy the middle space of migration. So assemblages of infrastructure not only facilitate and coordinate movement, but have the power to steer mobilities and produce different migrant subjectivities. So accelerated by COVID-19, the role of digital infrastructure in facilitating and controlling these mobilities has become indispensable, as seen in the integration of digital platforms into migration regimes, as well as the affordances in virtual travel and connectivity across spatial, distance, and time zones for family and friendship networks. So the role of digital infrastructures and media technology has become quite critical in governing the way that people care, communicate, live, work, and project their identities across borders. And this raises questions about digital citizenship. The last concept, 2 minutes, okay, the mobility justice. So in rethinking the future of mobility, that cannot be decoupled from urgent questions about how to make the transition to more environmentally sustainable and socially just mobilities. So there's several dimensions I just mentioned too. One is that in thinking of these future mobility transitions, we really cannot forget the shadow of the past. We need a decolonial approach to migration studies, one that acknowledges the enduring links between migration and colonialism, nation-state formation, control of cross-border mobility that's found within historical conjunctures and highlights enslavement, indigenous dispossession, and worldwide indenture as legitimate concerns. And second, a mobility justice perspective will also go beyond recognizing that climate change and environmental degradation are simply just drivers of migration. They are certainly not just that, but deeply entwined with mobility injustices. So work in this vein can focus on the interlocking socioeconomic practices and racial regimes and the inextricable links between mobility, energy production, consumption, extractive industry, and land use. Final sentence. So in other words, the mobility justice perspectives point us to consider who overwhelmingly benefits from mobility regimes of the future and whose lives are profoundly displaced and disrupted by exclusion from these regimes.
Thank you so much. It is a sign of how fascinating both of these presentations are that I'm struggling to do my job of, remembering to time. But now what I'd like to do is turn it over to our first discussant, Ibrahim Bagheri, and
all right, thanks so much. So So just as a way of introduction, I'm a computer scientist by training, and I work in an electrical engineering department. So what you hear from me is a computer scientist working in electrical engineering and music, future of mobility. So I have to say, I read both of these with great pleasure, and it took me many days to figure out some of the concepts, and I actually underlined many of it. One of the things that really caught my attention, and these are all new concepts to me, the sentence that Brenda had about Eurocentric theories to non-Anglo-Western context. I thought that's amazing, and maybe something that you guys always discuss, but it's amazing from someone who comes from outside. I want to touch on a couple of points, mostly from a technology perspective, because that's where I come from. The first point, when I think about technology and mobility, is the definition of self and what that definition of self means within that context. So the interplay between the definition or perception of self versus the technological imposition of an external meaning of self. So when we engage with technology, technology brings with itself some impositions. When I think about the technological imposition of this definition of self, I think it's mostly a reflection of the value system where the technology was developed, which is then embedded within the technology and then gets transferred to the people who engage with the technology. So mostly, and given technology is now crossing borders, or as soon as it's created, it's actually creating this potentially crisis of what is the definition of self within non-Western cultures where technology is predominantly created. And I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I'm saying it will disrupt what it means to think about yourself, and that will shape whether you want to move or not move from where you are. Oh, okay, I'm going to go faster. My second point is about how technology gives how technology gives ways to redefining the concept of place and access. So in the past, mostly geography defined what place meant and what access meant, because resources were placed in certain geographic locations, and therefore you had to be there to have access. And so when we think about access, governments could easily control access because they had control to who would enter the country. For instance, think about visas. But now this revised notion of access, because soft resources are becoming more important than hard resources, the concept of access becomes pretty much a non-geographical concept, because you don't necessarily have to be there to access it, and therefore governments can't necessarily control who accesses what. And so this gives way to new forms of mobility, which when I was thinking about it, I was thinking it's less about movement of geography, more about movement across socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is what defines whether you have access to resources or not. So the movement is not geographical. The movement is how do you move across social and economic classes. So for instance, you could be geographically located in the global south, but have access. And the other way around, you could be in the global north, but because of your socioeconomic status, not have access, right? And so technology will actually be changing dynamics in that aspect. My third point is the redistribution of soft and hard power through technology. So what I mean by that is when I think about immigration in the past, it's people moving to where resources are. Now it's mostly industries and entities moving towards where resources for them are. So it's less about getting the person to come to us. It's more about how does this entity move to another place and operate in that space? For instance, if you're running a data center, it would be easier for you to move your data center to a place where it's cheaper for electricity and you have access to cheap labor instead of trying to bring the cheap labor to your country. Okay. Or the other example is data labeling for AI companies. It's easier to move the data labeling practices to the global south as opposed to try to bring the cheap labor. So this, I think, when I think about this, I think this will intensify how we value technology and how that defines the concept of movement. Because when you think about technology, and for those of you who are in the stock market, you know that the value is not in the technology itself. The value is in the perception of the value of the technology, right? So you have the best technology, but the perception of the value of that technology is not there. So I think the power structure will be formed in a way where the people who currently have access to technology that is perceived as being valuable will continue to hold the power on defining what is valuable technology. And this creates this vicious cycle of who owns valuable technology, which then values and leads to economic growth. And therefore, if you are in the global south, for instance, trying to catch up technologically, and you invest in technology within your country, for instance, that wouldn't necessarily lead to economic growth because you don't have power to define what is the perception of the value of your technology. The perception of the value of technology is defined elsewhere, but not within your power. So in essence, I think it's not about who has access to technology, but it's more about who has access to redefining the perceived value of technology. And that actually defines also who wants to move or who can actually move physically and also across socioeconomic classes. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over now to Jacaranda Herrera for her.
Okay, thank you very much for these two papers. They were very stimulating for our discussion. My first point is about tensions on redefining migration between economic or forced migration. I think there are a lot of new categories that are going on, not only within the social sciences, but also in terms of policies. I'm thinking about mixed migration, survival migration, as a ways to capture the different kind of motivations that people have. And I understand that in terms of the social science category could be useful, I mean, to think about multiple and different kinds of ways to name what people are doing when they go from one way to another, from one country to another. But in terms of state and policy categories, I think it's more problematic because from what we've seen in some situations is that the category of mixed migration could, the consequence of using it could mean, for example, to avoid international protections to what is really forced migration. So I think I would like to highlight the tension of what it's called categories of practice and categories of knowledge, on how we could really think about very complex concepts in order to really grasp complexity. But when we think about policies or migrants' rights, it might be problematic. And I'm thinking on the same issue when we try to differentiate migration from refugees in a very, like two very separate worlds. It could be also problematic. that was my first point, just to think about. I mean, in terms of social, as a social scientist, I prefer to see that as a continuum and to grasp a lot of complexities. But in terms of migrant rights and policies, I think we have to be careful with that. So this was my first point, just to raise that issue. The second issue is more related to Brenda's concept, which I think are very interesting, of regimes of immobility and mobility. I think we need to complement the idea of regimes of discourse practices and institutions of mobility or immobility with how migrants navigate these regimes. I think that would be very, it's very good to look at these regimes of immobilities, and I think it's widened our idea that it's not only about states, but all kind of different actors, technology get into that. But I also think it's very important to look at from the point of view of migrants and how they navigate these regimes and how they, how they navigate these regimes. And my third point, if I have time enough, it's about, you didn't mention that now, but in your paper, you do mention that intersectionality is all, it's crossing mobilities. And I would say even mobility or being a migrant is part of of inequality dimensions. It's not just that the experience of migration is crossed by, all kinds of inequalities, such as gender, race, and so on, and you know that. But being a migrant is part of this articulation. It's an inequality in itself in some situations. And this is something that we need to think about more. It's not just crossed by inequalities. It can be, it can mean inequality itself. That would be my points.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over for our final discussant, Christy Eddy.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an epidemiologist who works in climate change and health. And so we're not really working in migration. I've been working in climate change for more than 30 years. And I'm interested in two particular aspects, both related to change and how does change happen? And what does it mean when there's a change in a trend? The first is I co-chair the process that develops socioeconomic pathways that are used with pathways of emissions to create scenarios. And these pathways include all kinds of variables that would be of perhaps interest in whatever analytic framework we set up. Things like urbanization, the Gini coefficient, changes in population. And importantly, there are 5 possible pathways into the future, because we know the future is inherently uncertain. And so you want to bracket the range of possibilities. These are designed to fill what we call the solution space. And so thinking about solutions in terms of sustainable development, adaptation, mitigation. I'm happy to talk more about that, but it is thinking about how current trends could shift. The second point I wanted to make is on the shorter term. There is something that's used quite widely by the military called wargaming. And it is an ongoing process. They actually do this literally all the time, where you put together possible visions of an event. And by definition, this event is outside of the range of what you've been considering, but is within the range of plausible. It can't be total science fiction, but it could actually be plausible. And then work with decision makers at all scales. I've been involved in a few where you bring together everyone from people who represent trusted voices in the local community to people who make fundamental policy decisions for a day or day and a half, depending on how long you want to do this. One was 3 days long. and work through these events of how would you manage? And the point isn't that you can't manage, because that's what's going to come out. It's beyond the range of what you've been thinking, so you can't actually manage it. The key is to learn lessons of what would you do? What do you have to start doing now? So if that event arises, then you are better prepared. You've thought through what you need to do from the perspective of various organizations, institutions. And these can be done for singular events. Things like the Pacific Heat Dome was certainly an event for which the Pacific Northwest in both countries was unprepared. Significant, about 1,000 people died in that event, 1,000 people who would not have died otherwise. So a mass casualty event. And the region did really quite a good job in trying to stand up some services on the fly. But 1,000 people died who didn't need to die. And you could do this at all kinds of other scales. And so thinking about various scales, thinking about what could happen. Robert and I were talking just before the meeting. I was involved in a wargaming exercise in about 2007. And one of them was an event that occurred before this wargaming exercise. The theoretical event that occurred before the wargaming exercise was about 200,000 Bangladeshis trying to get into India because of long-term drought and flooding events. And of course, India wouldn't be able to manage it, but what could they start doing today to be better prepared? What could countries start doing in terms of desertification and trying to think about new cultivars, think about what can be done to keep people at home? And then a half a point I wanted to make in reaction to some of the comments I just heard is that the discussion has been on the dynamicism of migration, but also you need to consider the dynamicism of everything else. That what pushes people into poverty is often a health impact. And so thinking about the drivers, the upstream drivers, as we would say in health, of these different kinds of events, and thinking about those interactions, because that's the place where you can find the interventions that could help make a difference to keep people in place when that's what they would like to do. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of it. That was on time. And so first, let's just have a round of applause for all of us. Really rich and stimulating set of ideas, interventions, provocations. What I'd like to do now is invite the speakers to come to each other for a round. Then I will open up and gather questions from those of us in the room. Shiva will then do the same with people online. So I anticipate about 3 rounds and whatever time we have left to continue the conversation. I know I have lots of thoughts and questions in my mind. So why don't I open it up to you folks first, if you have questions or responses.
Yeah, I can start since as well. So yeah, well, I'll start from the end, Chris. Yeah, that's very interesting. I was wondering, Chris, like when you say we do this, like who is doing this scenario? If I understand it correctly, the scenario building, and you spoke about 5 possible scenarios or solutions. You could, if Audrey allows, you could then take some time and tell us what are these 5 options, and yeah, in relation to that, definitely, actually, one thing that I am personally vested in is precisely to say what is happening generally, and migration is part of that, rather than say migration is happening somewhere there and then life is happening here. No, exactly, as you said, we need to consider everything else, and within this migration as an option. And actually, as you rightly pointed out, most people are sedentary or mostly sedentary, although we know that this calculation of right now 3.6% of the world population being a migrant, meaning living in a country different than the country where they were born, is totally an understated under calculation, because it first of all, as we were saying, a lot of people may have moved and gone back, so it depends on where you catch them. But also some colleagues, for instance, in Europe had done something, because in Europe equally, there's a very low level of mobility if you consider that you can move and establish yourself and work in every member state of the European Union. But then what these colleagues try to calculate is both short-term mobility, but also vicarious mobility. So if you have very close contacts and friends and colleagues who live in another country, shouldn't this count as a form of mobility? You don't need to be established for good in another country to be considered an intra-EU migrant. So that's both a question and a reflection. I have a question for Ebrahim. Mostly, yeah, I really liked what you said about redefining place and access. But my question is, I wasn't sure why you said, or if you can explain a bit more, but who redefines the perception of the value of technology? And like, if you can elaborate on that. And also, I wanted to make a comment and a reflection both on what you said about virtual mobility, but also what Johanna said about mobility or migration as a form of inequality in and of itself. And I wanted to say that actually mobility also comes back and defines status and socioeconomic well-being. So
yes.
virtual mobility, so you were saying, Ebrahim, socioeconomic status relates to your capacity to be virtually mobile. But then your capacity, you're being virtually mobile, comes back. So say if I'm, we usually give you the example of IT experts, but if I am a copy editor and I, for instance, work remotely around the world, that then translates back to me having a better socioeconomic status, which can become a virtuous circle. But similarly, actually, there was a time, I think about 10 years ago, that again, at least particularly in Europe, mobility was seen like a new form of capital. And actually the criticism there was that oftentimes mobility doesn't work for everyone. So it was at the time saying, oh, youth, like European youth, are characterized by this possibility. They're very mobile people, they're going all around the place, etc., whether for study, for work, for leisure, for law. And then there was this critical aspect, like, okay, but you have to see at all the cases where it didn't work out. Even in a situation where it's almost seamless from a policy or, how can I say, control perspective. So, yeah.
I have to go to a call. We're trying to get a proposal together. There is a group called the International Committee on New Integrated Climate Change and Assessment Scenarios, called ICONICS. Could be well remember.
International
Committee on New Integrated Climate Change Scenarios. It is composed of integrated assessment modelers and of impact modelers who have been coordinating for not quite a decade the scenarios that are being used in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The working group one, the climate scientists have done the emissions pathways in collaboration with the integrated assessment modelers. And then with the integrated assessment modelers and working group two, we've been working on these pathways. There's about 5,000 publications using them just in the last 3-4 years. So they've been heavily picked up by the community and they're being used in IPCC reports. I'm more than happy to talk more about them. They've been enthusiastically picked up by some sectors, less enthusiastically by health, been really way far behind on that. But there is quite a lot embedded in the narratives and in the quantifications that could be useful. There's a sentence on just about everything in the narrative. There's a sentence on travel. There's a sentence on trade. There's a sentence on all kinds of issues. These are the basic ones were developed with the intent that they could be used by the community to add extensions to them for areas of particular interest. There's a big E project being funded by a researcher in Norway, as I recall, on peace and conflict, who's extending these for those dimensions. I don't even know, there's so many as I said, thousands of papers have come out on these so far, and so there's a lot of very active work being done using in different dimensions. And from my perspective, it helps because it shows the long-term drivers. And so you can think in the context of long-term drivers, what that could mean for short-term change. And obviously happy to provide more. We have a website. We occasionally do webinars. We've got a bunch of webinars that you can go and learn more about them. We've got a range of resources. We should have more, and we'll be developing more as we go up towards the 7th IPCC assessment cycle. Perfect. And I know you have to run. I've got to run out to talk to my group. Anybody else from the group?
Just a quick footnotes, I guess. So just picking up on the mobility as capital and something that's kind of desired. I mean, in the field work I do in Southeast Asia, we've been interviewing sorts of children of migrant parents. Their parents have migrated as temporary migrants to be domestic workers or construction workers in order to earn remittances for their children. What we're finding is that the next generation may not want to migrate. In fact, they see that migration as quite destructive to family life, being the children of migrant parents, and their preferred aspiration is not to move. So we're yet to interview them in the next stage as to whether those immobility dreams can, in a sense, materialize, because as I think Chris, you're saying, I mean, everything's connected to everything else, and the drivers of migration still remain very similar. No jobs, sort of somewhere putting food on the table. So in that sense, whether immobility is an option, it could be the preferred option. I mean, not necessarily migration. And I just want to make one other point, again, sort of based on sort of the research that I've been involved in, that the categories that Anna has put up, of course, also highly interlinked, because displacement and recently with all the typhoons and floods going on in the Philippines, some of the migrant domestic workers that we're interviewing have their families displaced, a house basically fallen into the river, and so which then means trying to find another home for the family left behind. And so these kinds of displacements are highly linked to the motivation to migrate. So these migrant domestic workers working in Singapore, Hong Kong, and so forth now have to continue more migration because to earn the remittances in order for the displaced families to have a future. So in that sense, I mean, developing the typology also requires us to look at the interconnections between typologies. And then for Abraham was very struck by the idea that social mobility is actually probably the lens through which we can look at physical mobility. And these categories that you say that we social scientists work with, I mean, could in a sense also in policy terms become categories of control. So exactly. Because that's how, in a sense, policy makers, at least in my part of the world, tends to work. I mean, they define the category, and then the category comes with certain terms of engagement, and this then becomes a way of policing migrant lives. So I guess it does make me feel that when we think about categories, I mean, whilst we are very flexible with our categorization, it's kind of important to make sure that they don't become rigidified in policy terms. So, yeah.
I think that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Unless there are other comments that you folks want to make, what I'd like to do now is open it up to the audience to pose some questions. If that's okay. Great. So if you just raise your hand, and I will do my best to be able to read the card, and I apologize. But I'll do that. Okay, Christopher. And let me just say, I'm going to gather a few questions, but please
President Stewart, and I'll.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much. Really stimulating. I'm studying politics and environmental studies. Oh, I study politics and environmental studies, and most of my work is in Eastern Africa. But I have a bunch of questions. I'll focus on two. One is the question of regimes, which Gioconda mentioned. And first is, do we have regimes, or can we perceive what a regime that responds to the complexity of migration, what does that look like? And part of the reason I am interested in that is I see a lot of framing of securitization around climate displacement. But in fact, that doesn't always, the response to adaptation, this adaptation practices is often truly because, to the point Brenda makes, people want to stay. They're connected to land, they're connected to place. The idea or the narrative that people wish or hoping to find some pathway from their condition isn't always accurate, and often so the question is, how do we frame regimes or think about regimes that respond to the complexity of both narratives and reality? And the second is about technology to blunting mobility. And so similarly, I think of the rise of regionally specific technology rather than universal technology. So financial transfers, money transfers in Kenya, M-Pesa, this has allowed people to stay in place and stay rooted in home. And to your point, they don't want to leave. But do we think about technology from a regionally responsive and mechanism for blunting the need or the desire to move or for mobility? So thanks.
Yeah, very interesting, fascinating, actually, all the presentations. And what I'm taking away, one thing I'm kind of obviously hearing is this whole idea of the immobility regimes, or the immobility kind of discourse. And a lot of the things are kind of pointing in that direction. I love the tech, the intervention from tech, where the whole idea of even, I think already it's happening, the fact that geographical constraints are not as much at all that used to be there in the past, and we are going kind of much beyond that. So a lot of people with certain profiles are already not moving because they're quite happy to live in their bubble wherever they are. So that kind of thing. So it depends on, the socio-economic, that we were talking about. And I think in a way it might already be impacting the kind of people that are moving. We were talking yesterday about, change in the profile even of international students. People maybe are coming from, more backward kind of areas, people who have privilege already in their own countries, they prefer to stay. And so even the push and pull factors that we typically think about in migration, it's happening on the other side too. The kind of problems we are already having in Canada with, housing shortages, with job shortages. So people are beginning to wonder, like, what's the point? Can I not try to make things, So in that sense, the whole idea of brain drain and brain gain, some of these like typologies through which we have been looking at migration, is obviously they have to be interrogated, because the whole idea of the dynamics, not just of migration, but what's the context? What's the context? So the idea of, what are the long-term drivers, even of short-term migration? That was, I said I would ramble. I promised to do that.
Yeah, so Stein Montero, I'm a senior research associate with the CERC. So my question is also sort of related to what Alka was talking about on the technology aspect, except I'm a little bit more, I guess, pessimistic in the sense that technology does have the potential to open up borders in one sense, but there might be a new form of sort of border infrastructure that might be emerging on the technology side, and through issues with cybersecurity and data sharing and privacy aspects, where country or national governments might be more they might be raising borders to stop the flow of information, because ultimately that's what migration online is. It's just people looking for information from different parts of the world. And I think that aspect of it might be a new form of border control, a securitization that we might not need to think about, and how mobility in that sense may not be as free as we think about. And there's this other aspect of where um, we might also think about it from more of a digital equity lens. Not everyone also has access to the digital space. So just two things that we might want to discuss more about. Thanks.
Or bundles of questions by 3 people.
Maybe I'll quickly say a few words. So to Anna's point about who defines the perceived value of technology.
Or just speak up.
I'll speak up. Is this better?
Because we have
We have a microphone, but I don't think it actually echoes in here. So who defines, I think there was Anna's question, who defines the perceived value of technology? I don't have an accurate answer to it, but I have an example, right? Think about search engines and think about AI systems. Everyone thinks AI is the biggest technology around. If you think about the market size, the market value for search engines is, I think, I was just looking it up to have an accurate number, $250 billion. The market value for AI is 130 billion. So the perceived value of the technology is not aligned with the actual value of the technology, right? So there's a narrative. Microsoft puts $10 billion behind ChatGPT, and now everyone thinks that ChatGPT is the new revolution in technology, and there's nothing like it. But that's just a perception of what that technology is and what that technology can do.
You're gonna have to speak up, and I just noticed that people online are having trouble hearing.
Okay. The other point about technology allowing, I think Christopher's point, technology allowing people to stay locally. I haven't thought about that, but one of the thoughts that I have is this concept of trickle-down economy, I think applies also to trickle-down technology. You have technology locally, that's great, but it's not a technology at the global scale. So it's just technology that trickle down. Now, does that technology create equal opportunity for the people locally or not? I think it might get people to say, okay, this is enough for me to stay, but is it fair? And I think that's the bigger question of whether this trickle-down technology actually creates more socioeconomic divides globally. The concept about, I think, brain drain and brain gain, I think my own feeling is who defines brain, right? I think it's, again, this Western definition of what a brain is. And so going back to my kind of cultural background coming from Iran, there's always this debate on why do we have all our kids go to university and study all these technology, but we don't find an application for that technology within our society. So there's a lack of alignment between how you define brain within certain contexts. And therefore, if you define brain in a certain way, that brain needs to be in the context where that brain was defined. So essentially that brain will need to move to a place where it has value for it. So I think the concept of brain drain, brain gain really relies on who defines what a brain is. If you define brain in a different way, then it becomes valuable within the context where it's grown. But thank you.
Who would like to intervene next?
Well,
Jacinda, you look like you were about
just-
to.
Just a few things on this idea of social mobility and the possibility of that migration could bring to social mobility. Of course, I think I mean, it's not a fixed category. Being a migrant means many times transgress borders, social, economic, cultural borders, which is, I think it's nice and I mean, it's important and it's related to this idea of navigating regimes of different kind of regimes. But I do think that in many societies, being a migrant is a kind of identity also. I mean, and it's also a dimension of social inequality. I'm thinking about xenophobia and the relationship of, being a migrant and xenophobic environment. So this is what I wanted to mention, and I definitely think it's very important to take into account how certain categories can become categories of control, not just categories of practice. Yeah, so thank you, Brenda. Yeah. That's it.
I'm gonna ask everybody to mind to speak up because I understand that people online are still having trouble.
Okay, so many thoughts in my head, but I guess the first thing to say is, of course, mobility and immobility is not a binary choice. And if you ask most people, the key is not so much whether you move or you stay, but the ability to have the choice of moving or staying. I mean, that's what the young people of the next generation with migrant parents are saying, that it's not that they want to stay or they want to move, but they want to have the choice of moving or staying. And the other thing, apart from the ability to choose, is the conditions of that mobility. Many of them are saying that we do not want to migrate like our mothers to become domestic workers, but if there's a skilled job, and given that I'm already better educated than my parents because of the parental remittances, I would like to, in a sense, migrate differently. So the conditions of mobility is also very important in thinking about, I take the point that mobility regimes need also to consider, as Vikonda says, the migration trajectories and the navigation of these trajectories. For me, mobility regime does contest to how, in a sense, what are the structures that govern mobility, as well as what are the cultures of migration. So, because it's not just about rules and regulations, but it's also about what people think is the norm, what are the kinds of dominant discourses about being a migrant, whether there's a good thing, a bad thing. Those kinds of aspects needs to be taken into consideration as well for a very unpredictable future. I still can't see clearly, and I wish I could ask Christy a bit more about how you project these scenarios. What kind of context do these scenarios emerge from? I mean, what are the conditions of mobility that's projected in these in the Brave New World? I mean, but she's not here, so I won't ask. And another issue that I wanted to ask everybody and pick your brains actually is that at a different workshop, someone was saying that AI is moving much faster than robotics. So that's to say that in that sense, brain work will, in a sense, may be overtaken by AI. I don't know. And those of us who do only brain work may soon be made obsolescent. But manual work is not so easy to replace, and that robotics, which was supposed to be like the future of obliterating manual work, is not happening as fast as AI. So what the implications would be, I know nothing, very little about digital and sort of stuff, but that I thought was worth discussing. I mean, in looking at the digital frontier, the technological frontier, and the future of mobility.
One more question.
Well, I just wanted to, I don't know, we have a chance to.
Sure. And then,
Yes.
We can, Monty, we can pass it. Okay. Because you don't have to. If Audrey, you can pass it down.
I really, really appreciated that very last question and comment you made, Brenda, about this division between sort of manual skills and I think it connects to what Ibrahim was saying earlier as well in terms of what we consider a brain and the division between sort of AI taking over intellectual work versus robotics being able to take over certain kinds of manual jobs and the real disconnect there and the fact that one is actually moving further ahead than the other. And yet in our policy and also in our thinking and in our narratives about immigration in Canada, at least, that really has not caught up. We still really, really seem to focus on, you know, the best and the brightest narrative. And the best and the brightest really, you know, is defined in a very specific way. And so at least in the Canadian context, and I think in a lot of contexts of countries that are looking to recruit high-skilled workers, this issue, the issue of how AI will change the future of work really needs to be explored. And I think thinking about immigration as part of a whole of society issue, including how work is going to look in 50 years, is something we really need to kind of focus on and reconceptualize, which we're doing really in today's workshop. So I want to mention that.
First of all, I want to say there's a session after lunch that Rupa is sharing on the future of work and different kinds of mobilities. So we're going to delve deeper into that. I have a few, yeah, that's very interesting. I have a few comments. I think one that really fine and breaking your seems to be Raven, and I apologize for this, as you probably know, they're redoing the roof over there. So sometimes, but we're hoping for a brand new roof with lots of sunlight coming in. So I think, Stein, you mentioned something. Yeah, I just realized it's the elephant. It can be controlled. So we were assuming, as migration scholars, that physical mobility is always controlled and is contested, but then virtual mobility can also be contested. And yeah, I think that's a very big, a very important point that you made. But also in relation to what you again said, Ibrahim, that I hadn't dawned on me. I keep saying to everyone, you know, when we talk about migration and even public discourses on migration, I keep saying there's no single national interest. The way usually politicians present it is there's one interest, say, of Canada with regard to immigration, or one interest of Italy, but that's not true. There's many interests within the country, depending on who you are and, you know, what is your role. So if you're an employer, if you're a high skilled worker, low skilled. Okay, because that is, we have a, it's a dynamic mic. Yeah, it's a mic. It's a mouth. And usually it has eyes on it. Yeah. No, but it has eyes actually, so I find it very funny that you think it's looking at me. So I was saying that there is no single one public interest, national interest in the way it's often portrayed by politicians or policymakers about immigration, classical immigration. But it occurs to me there's no single interest about virtual mobility or, you know, technology, while I would have thought of the company interests behind technology. Yeah, that's obvious, but not in such a, yeah, it is true, like so naive, but we all thought that ChatGPT was some natural process. People in their labs, a little bit like Chris was saying, were getting together, working on their thing, like we all work on our scientific thing, and suddenly this ChatGPT came up, and then suddenly it's, for instance, revolutionizing the way we teach and actually, you know, examine students. And then you say, no, Microsoft had the plan on how to, you know, come back to the market. So I think that that's another lesson for me, is how to look into the interests behind virtual mobility. And I'm thinking again, Chris, you mentioned, and I know you've done more work on this, and we had discussed it about the least, or what we would have thought as the least likely communities to embrace technology, like nomadic communities in East Africa, using, you know, bypassing the, say, the landline of phones, or bypassing some first generation technologies going directly to phone banking apps and, trading apps, etc. But then what are the interests? Again, you're thinking, oh, there's some phone company behind it, but maybe there's more to it, and there's more inequality, as you said, Ibrahim, like how are we putting more money into ChatGPT, but we could have put more money into some apps that would help other things and other places in the world. The third thing that I think Brenda said, I think what you're saying about these kids and the ability to choose prompts a question. When we say, and we talk, and I think we both criticize the whole discourse of regular, what is it called? Safe, regular, and orderly migration. And both Brenda and I have been brainstorming about what is sustainable migration. And it occurs to me in relation to this debate, the sustainable modes of governing migration include how, for instance, someone like these children of migrant parents have an ability to choose in a changing context, which is rightly, as you say, it's not if these kids were in the place of their mothers, but these kids in this new situation, did the migration of their parents put them in a more sustainable condition? So that is our notion. And last but not least, I just want to say something. We think that, and I think, Joconda, you said, oh, migration in a way is a transgressive behavior by itself. But I think then we need to think about the historical context. Before the national state, people were moving within very vast areas that were under empire, and they didn't even have any passports on any such nomenclature, and there were no geographical borders in the way we understand them today, where you cross and here's Canada, here's the United States. We've been seeing this last few days, even the closure of, or this Roxham Road, famous Roxham Road, the provincial road where asylum seekers were entering from the United States and Canada. And I know, I've never been to Roxham Road, but I know this place. There is this little path where people used to walk, and they would be met by someone in the Canadian border saying, now you're in Canada. So it's like, but this is a very modern fiction, if I can say that. So mobility was not, the whole of human history is within mobility. And I'll just conclude with that. These days, I'm reading a novel by a French writer called Eric Emmanuel Schmidt, and it's called Lost Paradise, Paradis Perdu. And halfway through the novel, I realized this is about Noah and the big deluge. And he's recreating in the novel how this Noah and his family, and like the people who were saved, how did they live it? That we think they knew what was happening, but they didn't know what was happening. And they had been a sedentary community communicating with their valley. And okay, in the novel, it's a lake. And suddenly they find themselves, okay, he invents how it all happened, and they find themselves on this boat that is rocking, and they don't even know there is a sea. So this is just to say that the very concept of mobility or immobility is so historically related, but defined, but we tend to forget. We think everything is like it is now.
Thanks. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Shiva, who will moderate the online questions.
Sure, I'll use the mic just in case. So we also some comments and some questions. I've tried to collate and synthesize here around technology. So one person's comment was, technology's connectivity advantage also has the power to mobilize people. Seeing someone from a similar background and pathway doing better elsewhere may be the trigger for someone who ultimately decides to leave in search of the same or the better life. Someone wants the panel to talk more about how technology can define self in a different way from an individual or society, and what's the significance it may have from the point of view of migration. Another comment says, technology fixes or minimizes geographic or location constraints. Yet, is it not that access to technology itself can be substantially constrained by location? And then moving away from socioeconomic access to technology, somebody asked the question, how does regional politics affect access to digital mobility?
The part where we have a musical interlude. Norma? It is the case that we are unused to actually taking time, you've got to think about how you answer it. One more, go ahead, why don't you just read it out now?
Sure. So just one more. From Naomi, she says, given increased technology, more brain work can be done remotely, while much manual work needs to be done on the ground and won't be able to be automated easily, for example, the trades. This may have a significant impact on mobility and immobility choices and migration regimes. They may not be in sync.
It looks like you put down your pen as if you were a student writing an exam and you're ready. Who would like to begin? Anna, you put down your pen first. So I'm gonna...
No. Yeah, I think when the last comment, I suppose it's Naomi Alba. Hi, Naomi. Yeah, that says something for instance, main destination countries. Really redefining what does who is a desired migrant, and I think that can relate to countries like Singapore or Canada, who have very different mobility regimes, but both highly regulated. But it also can I think influence, if we think of those countries and areas of the world where there's much less regulation or much less possibility for regulation and control, and how this shapes up and how it relates to demography. I think what we have not been discussing so far is the fact that right now there is a certain demographic imbalance between certain world regions, but what demographers tells us is that this is going to be the demographers in the room, that there will soon be a time that there will be a plateau, and then we have, and I don't know what Chris would be saying with their scenarios. Have they thought about that? That is my one, and I believe I didn't get the second question that you asked or compared, Shiva. You said technology advantage that mobilizes people to move, and then you said something else before the point on geographical limitations and.
You've seen someone from a similar background, a pathway doing better elsewhere, and trigger, maybe the trigger for someone who ultimately decides to leave in search of that same moment.
Yeah, kind of relative deprivation. Yeah. No, I don't know. I don't have something else to add. I don't.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I know, Jeff. I know,
It was more
Jeff,
about
are you?
technology. No, actually, since it was more about technology, I don't know.
Okay.
You're on the spot.
About the technology and changing, I think, definition of self. I'll give an example.
Right,
I think example is easier to work with. So, we have keyboards. We work with a keyboard. The reason we have a keyboard and not some other technology to input is because the Latin characters are individual characters where you type, and it makes sense for it to be a keyboard. And this concept of keyboard got transported around the globe, and now even the languages that use a different type of writing, they still adopt a keyboard model, although it's much harder for them to type with the keyboard, right? But that has become the technology vehicle for communicating on computers. So now when you think about kids who are now when they start with a computer, no longer write much on a piece of paper, how that impacts the way they value their own language, the things they write, it's so difficult to communicate that with technology, and then how they perceive their own language versus a language that has Latin characters. And it completely shapes their value system with regards to their own literature they read, the value for their culture versus a more Latin-based. So technology kind of impacts how you perceive your own definition of your background, yourself, and so on, with even simple things like the keyboard. Okay? And you can extend this to all sorts of things. Think about an app where all the metaphors are North American metaphors that have become icons on the app. Therefore, in North America, you automatically, for instance, relate to an icon because this is a symbol that you use on a daily basis. But think now you go to Bangladesh or India or rural areas in the global south, you don't necessarily understand what is the concept behind the icons you see in an app, right? Therefore, this becomes like an existential thing that why don't I relate to these global concepts? And it impacts how you perceive yourself. About I think the impact of AI on future of work and all that, I think in the next session we'll talk about it. But I think AI will mostly impact creativity. Creative industries are the ones that will be safe. Everything else will change. Even I think creative industries will be safe. So creative people are the people who will have jobs in the future. I think if you're a faculty member, you're teaching the old, same old course. Probably in 5 years' time, none of your students will show up and they're all on Coursera or somewhere listening to the content. But if you're this innovative, creative faculty member who uses new pedagogical approaches, delivers content in a different way, engages students in a different way, then you're the person who all the students want to come to the lecture, and you will still remain in demand. So it's all about creativity, and I don't think, at least where we are with AI, AI will replicate creativity. It will replicate all sorts of labor work. It will replicate content creation, all of that stuff. But it would be very hard for it to replicate creativity. So I think the part of the future of work which will remain very much in demand the way it is now is creative work. Everything else will change substantially.
I just kind of you respond to that. In a sense, if there's so much valorization on innovation and creativity, it also means that we need to keep moving faster. So speed becomes valorized, and there is and the past basically disappears very quickly because if creativity means, I guess it depends on what creativity means. If creativity means doing something differently all the time, rather than the same way, then there is a cycle of creative obsolescence. Yeah, so that consumes a lot of resources. So each version of the iPhone basically consumes so much resources that and that connects with questions about environmental issues. Yeah.
Anna, you wanted to take it.
Yeah. Okay. What was it?
Right, there was a hand on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So I think once Anna is done, we're going to do another round here.
Okay. I had never thought about the keyboard, but my own mother tongue does not use Latin characters. I'm Greek by mother tongue, so it's fascinating what you said. But I have two answers to that. Well, first one that comes, I'm thinking, which world regions does this apply? And for instance, like in North America is totally Anglo-dominated. South America is probably Spanish-dominated with some Portuguese. But Europe has a wide variety of languages, all of which fit the keyboard. So that is one comment, but at the same time, I, as someone who has lived for most of my life before coming to Canada and Europe, I always find it kind of, if not annoying, at least awkward, how Anglo-dominant we are here, and how people perceive it as strange that you might be comfortable in more than one language, which, for instance, in Africa is the standard, because you have usually 2 languages at school and 1 in your home that is a different language. So what else? I think that that's a reflection of what you say about technology, but I want to say now we have, for instance, apps where you speak and it writes. And our kids, probably those who are perhaps in elementary school now, so they ChatGPT and similar already exist, they might interact with technology much differently, not through the keyboard. When we know that in ChatGPT, you write something and then you tell it not just generate a text, but generate an image. And I'm afraid that this will impact also creativity. So the jobs that are creative. But going back to what technology will do to mobility, there is, and I think someone from Shiva's comments also was referring to that it will open up, like the reason why these metaphors, these whatever North American jokes or jargon is becoming international is certainly because of social media and technology. And before social media was the internet or email and television, and now it's social media and it's another level. But I wonder whether it's also our limitation, because I remember with Alka in one workshop that we did with a writer and an author here, and he was talking about Punjabi transnational literature and how there is a whole market out there that obviously I'm not familiar with. I know Punjabi writers to the extent that they have been translated in English or French, but I don't know. And he was saying that there is a very vibrant literary scene in Vancouver, for instance, for Punjabi writers, and I wonder whether the same is, for some of the languages that have large audiences, and I would include, for instance, Farsi, obviously Mandarin, other languages. So, and how technology interacts with that, and in terms of whether then this, because also science said, it's all about search and information, or also search and infotainment or entertainment, and then how we connect, how do we become virtually mobile, and how this can be actually also very much limited control. And then what does this mean? Do we then desire to stay, or do we desire to move? Because we might just actually desire to stay because we feel, I have all the mobility that I need, whether in terms of my creativity or in terms of my work. So why should I move? So that is, in a way, in response to this reflection.
So Shiva has a comment from Naomi on this, and then I'm going to turn it back to Andrew.
Naomi says the notion of the changed image of self brought on by technology, as described by Ibrahim, seems like a modern day version of colonialism or imperialism by the private sector digital creators.
Nods around the room. Andrew.
Sure. So yeah, I had a switch in response to your comments about creativity. The creative professor, the creative professor being protected.
Well, everyone else, the rest of us, the rest of them, the rest of us, I'm not sure which, are screwed. And so I sort of quickly imagine, I suppose, 3 scenarios, maybe worsening scenarios, but just that kind of came to mind in terms of the sort of creativity in relation to ChatGPT and AI and so on. And the first is that you could say the creative person is safe, but the other prof, all their students disappear because they're just on Coursera. But of course, the creative prof, him or herself, is the one on Coursera with the 10 or 20,000 students. And why have universities when you can have a single virtual faculty of 100 professors that just teach creatively to the planet, and everyone else can just go back to, I don't know, shoveling things from point A to point B. The second thought is with regard to ChatGPT. I think we often I find myself doing this. We make comments, self-reassuring comments about ChatGPT based on what it can do now. So, oh, I saw a ChatGPT story, or I saw a Mid-Journey painting. It wasn't really very good. But a year ago, none of this existed at all. So I think we have to think about what ChatGPT version 13 is going to do, not what version 4 is currently doing. And why would creativity be safe necessarily? And then, is it possible that our sense of creativity is safe because we were trained in a pre-AI era? We learned about paintings, we read fiction, we saw creative ideas, and then ChatGPT, at least version 4, seems wanting. But we're going to raise a generation where if Mid-Journey images become the creative standard, then does what we appreciate in creativity itself get changed because of the flood of AI generated content? And so apparently the Hollywood strikers are worried about scripts being good enough. I mean, a lot of Hollywood scripts already looked like they were written by AI, but you know, does it get worse? Where, you know, anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I think Harry was first. Harry, yes. Audrey was pointing to you.
Yes. What? But we can go from
Maybe
and that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Get them all.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Nice to see so many familiar faces. My name is Anna Beduska. I'm a professor of law at the University of Exeter in the UK. My question, well, I do work on questions relating to technology, AI, migration, etc. But my question is to bring back a little bit to what I understand was the topic of this whole session, on thinking about these categories in this framework for migration and mobility. From what I understand, and my question is, if we're trying to categorize so much, including the virtual aspect as well, how does it impact the protection? And so, being a professor of law, my views are more on the legal side. But for me, if we bring it back to the human, so not thinking about the ChatGPT and the technology at the moment, but bringing it back to the human that deserves the protection. And what we see nowadays is more and more a fragmentation in the way in which protection is offered to people, and this discourse about let's have migrants and refugees compartmented, so then who gets protection when, and who can not be afforded to be protected. The same concerning climate refugees or migrants or internally displaced people. And so if we start to add these dimensions, especially the virtual, aren't we fragmenting it too much more, the protection, and giving ways to governments and to other stakeholders to actually diminish this level of protection that we already have, and thinking about human rights and thinking about refugee protection and other legal frameworks that we have domestically and international. So that's the reflection that I wanted to provoke a little bit to all of you. Thank you.
Now over to Harry. Go ahead.
My question is, when we talk about the future of human
Technology now.
Oh, it was okay. So yeah, this is exactly what I'm going to ask about here. When we talk about the word future of human mobility, what time frame are we reflecting on? I mean, thinking about 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 50 years down the road. So when we look at the the development, the pace at which technology is developing, and there has been, digitalization work, a lot of work to a great extent. At the same time, there are lots of areas, work, which can never be replaced by technologies, no matter how advanced they will be. So therefore, I don't remember the author's name right now, but I think Castell, he talks about self-programmable and those who are not self-programmable people who can align with and move with the pace of technology, and those who cannot. So when we think about 50 years down the road, so don't we envision or see a very grim world where there will be, very unequal world, technologically advanced people, educated people earning a lot of money and those background? Because I can see that there is access to technology. Even poor people, even in the global south, can have access to technology, but they are more consumer of technology, right? For example, buying cell phone, for example, the money goes to the manufacturer rather than making profit of making money or generating income out of technology. So don't we see a grim world? It's pessimistic, but just I wanted to pose this question.
Thank you. Yes, so I had also a question a bit related to the previous comments about. So I wanted to come back to the concept that Brenda proposed of mobility justice, and so I think it connects a bit to the previous question. So because we see that a lot of the changes that have been discussed during the panel, so climate change, new technologies, also health related issues. There are issues that create a lot of new forms of injustices, but there are also global issues that are difficult to manage just at the national level. So there was this kind of also discussion between what is territorial and what is deterritorialized now with new technologies. But the question is it raises is at what level can it be managed? Because states are still very important in determining the rules of the games, and at the same time, so there are these new forms of regulations that are trying to be shaped at a more transnational levels. But then there are the issues that all these topics that we've talked about in this discussion. So climate change, new technologies, they are often talked about from a sectorial point of view, and mobility issues are sometimes considered as another sector and are not discussed necessarily within like the mobility dimension within new technology. The mobility dimension within climate change is considered as one aspect of it, but not necessarily considered in such a comprehensive way as what we have in this panel. So my question is really about the question of new forms of regulation and how this notion of mobility justice can be a way to kind of inform new forms of deliberation, of regulation, and at which level. Okay.
Very, very quick response. Yeah, I just wanted to refer for a moment to what Chris spoke about. She's not here now, but about looking at, using like a futuristic kind of a lens and more scenario building from a problem solving, solution finding kind of a way. So in that context, when we look at it, what kind of application, because when I think of that from a paradigm perspective, it's more like coming from a prevention, preparedness, kind of a way of, of a lens. And we find that like, and so what would be the application of that within migration, particularly because, we know that there's always a shortage of resources. And how possible is it to apply that kind of futuristic lens when the struggle is always how to meet the current need? So would they be in a real world resources
to actually use some of that in the context of migration, and what kind of implications even might it have for policy building or, protective regimes and things like that? I don't know if somebody had a thought about that. Thank you.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you all. Nick Dreyer from TMU here. I had a couple comments or kind of areas to maybe focus attention on again, or with a little bit more detail. The first is, I think it came up in some of the discussion papers, but really centering class and capital, I think in this discussion a little bit more might be valuable. I think when it came up with the idea of mobility, is it an inequality or is it a form of capital? I wonder how that relates to the kinds of capital that people already have. If you're cosmopolitan, like Anna was mentioning, and then you have this ability to move all over, that increases your capital. Whereas if you're the vagabond, to also use Anna's idea, this mobility or migration may be an inequality. The other thing on the idea of creativity being safe from AI, I'm thinking about that in the context of there's been a lot of art being produced, and some of it, in some of the most prestigious museums around the world that is created by AI or heavily influenced by AI, and artists are also collaborating with AI. I wonder if rather than it being creativity, what's the role of relationality and kind of relationships and how is that safer from AI? Because, when you were describing the creative professor, you were kind of describing the professor that is engaged in relationship with their students, that is kind of creating a classroom environment where they're seeing in the moment what the students need and responding to that. And so also that makes me wonder, what is this relationship between kind of being connected on a relational level and being able to be creative? And then the third, and then the last thing that I wanted to highlight is, I think in the context of this conversation, we're talking a lot about international mobilities, and I wonder where intranational mobilities fit into this. And, this is something that Anna mentioned a little bit in her paper with the displacements, and you see that in the United States, in particular with communities that are being wholly relocated in Alaska due to climate change, or also in Louisiana as well. So how do those national mobilities fit into the conversation we're having?
I think I wanted to add, if we go back to the concepts and thinking about the framework, I wanted to put in here solidarity. And so I think a lot of our future imagining and a lot of the way that we've been talking about futures are pretty negative. And I understand why that is. And if we think about the conflict, we think about corporate influence, corporate capture, I look at government uses of AI, automated decision-making systems, and welfare. And so, of course, we're seeing a lot of negative impacts. And this, of course, extends to the way the technology is being applied at borders and implemented to control, police, surveil, and punish. And in response to that, some of the things that I'm seeing, at least in terms of welfare, is a lot of solidarity-based mobilizations and resistance. And I think that's the place to think about alternative. Those are places to find alternative imaginaries for the future, right? And I think that, Brenda, you're mentioning of interviewing children, right, of the migrants, and they're clearly already thinking about, okay, well, I don't want this, I want something else, and what is that? And so I think that kind of work is happening all over. Maybe we'll get into this in the next section on the future of work, but there's also a lot of move for solidarity-based mobilizations. And I'm thinking, Anna, about your categories, right, of migration. Well, of course, there's solidarity-based options and opportunity there. And this connects also to the kind of ways that we're seeing people responding globally to the negative implications of corporate influence. And I also wanted to throw in here politics. This is just, it's floating around in my mind as we've been talking all morning. And do we need to be thinking more about politics, about what that means?
Okay, I think, I want to throw in a question at the end, but if you don't have time for it, that's fine. And it really is very basic, which is, what are we talking about when we talk about mobility? Because we talk about it sometimes as if mobility is movement. Observed movement equals mobility. Sometimes we talk about it as a capacity to move, but that's not the same as simple movement. I'm very mobile, but I don't move very much anymore. And as I get older, I will get less mobile, both because I'm less desirable to other countries. That would be a way of, but I'm also less physically mobile. Right? But the capacity to move is not the same as actual movement. And sometimes I think there is slippage between that in how we talk about it. And finally, you know, when we talk about mobility justice and free movement, that really presses on, is the capacity to move simply the capacity to navigate existing state-imposed constraints? People who are highly educated, young, and from wealthy countries can navigate constraints better than people who don't have those attributes. But that's not the same as free movement, which is movement in the absence of state constraint, right? It just means that you get permission to move more often than somebody else does. Those things, I think, actually matter to a project on mobility. I get the idea that we shouldn't all be imposing a single narrow meaning of mobility. But if we don't have some sense, shared understanding of what we mean by mobility, it isn't just everything to everybody all the time, then I think we might miss some things, and we might not always be, we might be speaking at cross purposes. So I just wanted to make a plea for, what are we talking about when we talk about mobility? Is that a question to launch on? With that, I turn it back to all of you. The last one.
Mariam, I have some answers, if I can, or questions, and I know we're getting close to lunchtime. So one thing, I think what Joanna just said and Alka said is very important. I hadn't thought about it, and it's a pity that Chris doesn't come back, because the scenario exercise that she was presenting, you were right, that it's about prevention. Like, there's something bad happening, how do we react? It wasn't about how can we make things better? How can we plan that, you know, I don't know, whatever our regulation of climate and health is proactively thinking of a better future rather than thinking how do we prevent. But I suppose that comes from perhaps the organizations that are supporting. And I'm not saying it's negative, but it is really kind of an unspoken assumption that the scenario is about something bad. So how about exactly alternative imaginary? So I wanted to emphasize that, which is also, Audrey, relates to what you said. So very clearly, yeah, you spoke about mobility as observed movement, capacity to move, and then mobility justice, free movement, capacity to navigate mobility regulations and constraints. And I wanted to say, it's not just that, actually you said only constraints, and I want to say it's not about only constraints, because for instance, again, in Canada, but in many other countries, we wish to attract some people. So we wish some people that should be mobile, so because they are highly skilled, or because they are health workers and we need health workers, or because they're construction workers and we need those, or because we need young people because we're an aging society, but we don't wish others. So it's the regulations, which brings us back, I think, to the nation state very much, as well as international organizations. And I want to conclude by a reflection on what Anna said. And hi, Anna. Actually, I was looking at it and I think, but I know this person, but who is she? And I want to apologize. I mean, I know Anna Achilles was also there, or Jeremy, and they arrived just a bit late and didn't come forward, not to disturb us. Yeah, it's always, it's a difficult question for me. And I've been kind of playing with this idea for a few years. Because, for instance, several years ago, we had done a workshop. We were trying to say, for instance, in Europe, there's very high protection for what is called national minorities or historical minorities, I would call them, people who lived in a state when the state became independent. And these people have a totally different set of rights compared to what we call post-migration minorities. So people who are 1.5, second generation and later. And I was suggesting that that in countries where, for instance, like anywhere from, say, Switzerland or Italy to Romania, who have in their constitution things enshrined about these historical minorities, but they are much more reluctant or less prepared with regard to migrants and post-migration minorities. But then the answer was, what you do is you're going to take away rights from those minorities rather than give rights to the post-migration ones. And same with the refugees or asylum seekers. If we risk of, yeah, and I do see this risk. But at the same time, if we know that reality is so much more complex, so the question is, like, as I said, so many people are fleeing situations that are very complex, and it's not just about, I'm personally persecuted because I'm this or that, but the situation in my country is just not viable. And for instance, we know, and you certainly know better than me, and then, for instance, the Cartagena Declaration foresees those situations. The African Union Protocol for Human Rights foresees those declarations. But also to reflect to what Naomi was saying, yeah, we still only speak about the Geneva Convention. So how about we use those? You're a lawyer too. So how about we use those instruments more? And also that one wonders whether, for instance, well, we already know there is this case of, so-called climate refugees, and some people are pushing towards that. But again, we know it's very complex. It's pretty much impossible unless you're a citizen of an island that is about to disappear, and then you're going to be a refugee, a climate refugee. We know many other people are displaced, but they cannot be in any way kind of ascertained as climate refugees. So there's very little legal background there. But how do we cater for those people?
I look at my notes and there's so many question marks rather than any real answers. But I guess just to articulate some of the thoughts here, that I think Audrey is absolutely right that we need to, in a sense, pin down what we mean by mobility. Yet it is such a slippery concept in some ways. So for me, putting some parameters around mobility, I focus largely on migration as opposed to transport mobility, for example. But at the same time, even with migration, there's now the virtual and the physical, the internal and the international, the long-term, the short-term, the temporary and the permanent. So it's already so diverse, even if you just want to use migration as a way of circumscribing what we want to discuss. I'm not sure I know what to do with that. So I'm a little bit, I have to say, skeptical about creating typologies because I don't know how to do that given the interconnectedness of everything else. So I thought the way to go about it is to look at, so how can you be conceptualized? How can you conceptualize? Which is why I thought about regimes and infrastructure and mobility justice as a way, but that obviously also has its faults. In terms of mobility justice, for me, I think Joanna speaks about solidarity as a way of mobilization as solidarity. But and that certainly would be the case in some places, but it's also not an option in many places, right? Where people are struggling with just putting food on the table, and sometimes even mobilization is something that they don't have enough resources to do. So so what do I do with that? I mean, again, it's back to the choices I guess each of us makes. So for myself, I guess I try to focus whatever research resources I have on looking at those kinds of things. I mean, like, for example, much of my research is focused on the sending countries as opposed to we're very well researched receiving countries. And then in terms of sort of more decolonizing kind of approach to it, not sort of adopting sort of, I think, Western Anglo-centric kind of theories that grew up here. I don't mean Canada, but I mean in the north, and seeing how it might well, how to adapt it, but also to come up with theorizations that come from parts of the world where there's so much less research. So I'm not making any sense, but I think the idea here is that as researchers, we also practice our citizenship, I mean, of the world, I mean, whether it's digital or sort of more sort of physical citizenship, I mean, by the choices that we make in trying to think about a more just, equitable, and sustainable future of mobility, which is, at the end of the day, still quite dystopic to yes. Simply because I don't see many avenues of solidarity and mobilization. I mean, in the parts of the world that I work with, but maybe I haven't tried looking hard enough. Yes.
Anybody else? Well, maybe just to highlight the issue of class and capital around all this. Maybe we are going to talk about that in with other papers, and particularly when we will talking about labor, because of course digitalization and technology have different impacts on very wide and different impacts on that. But I do think it's an important conversation, because sometimes it's not only about individual choice or the possibility of other people to be able to choose, but there are, of course, other issues around the possibility to choose, the conditions of mobility, as Brenda, and I would say also structural issues, like I remember during the pandemic, it was very striking how there's this Chinese anthropologist called Xiang Biao and Nina Sorensen. They were talking about who can move in order to other people to not move. So that's another kind of dimensions of inequality. I mean, who is able to move, who is going to move so that other people can get confined, so delivery workers and so on. So there was a bunch of people moving when they were not supposed to move, in order to other people to stay at home. And this is something that happened, that was highlighted during the pandemic, but it's already, I mean, it's still happening. It's lifestyles, and it's capitalism, and it's a bunch of other issues. So I would say that this is also important to look at. And the other inequality dimension, and it has a lot to do with capital. And the second issue, I think it's important in terms of different impacts and possibility to choose or not between north, south, and all these kind of dimensions, is security versus insecurity also, because I was thinking on this in Ecuador and in Colombia and in Peru, you have also a lot of intergenerational social mobility. So children from migrant parents who are, they got education, they could stay, they had the possibilities of maybe the possibility to choose, but they live in very insecure environments, very violent environments. I'm thinking about Central America, for example, or other issues. So you have structural insecurities and protection, even though you might have the social conditions, better social conditions than your parents, but you are constrained by other issues, and more constrained with this dichotomy between security and insecurity, very insecure environments from, very simple social robbery to political violence. So this is the other aspect, I think, is important to think about how when you talk about technology and mobility, you also have to talk about new kinds of inequalities that come from other environments, political environments, social environments. I think this is something that was mentioned at the beginning, that how we think mobility, not only in terms of migration of the kind of mobilities, but also as related to other political, social, and economic dimensions of life itself. So maybe this is the comment I wanted to do. So how to think not only these classical ways of looking at social inequalities that we tend to, but looking at these other kinds of, inequalities that emerges not only through technology, but also with technology, not only through climate change, but also within climate change, like security, insecurity, who moves, who is not able to move, and who moves in order to other people to stay involved.
And thank you so much. I'm giving you had the last word, but in a way that I think pushes us forward into the ongoing conversation that we'll have over the next day and a half. So I want to thank you. And of course, Anna, Brenda, Ibrahim, and Christy, and all of you present and online, virtually present, for a wonderful launch to this conference.